Welcome back to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. The snow fell in silence the night Gunnery Sergeant Michael Callahan decided he had lived long enough. Not in the way that ends with a gun or a rope, but in the quiet way a man stops fighting, stops caring, stops believing there's a reason to see another sunrise. At 52 years old, Mike sat alone in his late father's hunting cabin, deep in the Montana backcountry, surrounded by mountains that didn't ask questions and trees that didn't judge. The fire in the stone hearth had burned low. He hadn't bothered to add more wood. Cold didn't matter much anymore. He'd survived Fallujah, survived the screaming chaos of urban warfare, the taste of dust and blood, the weight of brothers he'd carried through smoke and bullets. He'd survived burying men half his age beneath folded flags while their mothers wept into his chest. But he hadn't survived the silence that came after. First, it was Sarah, his wife. 50 years old and gone in 6 months. Cancer that moved like wildfire through her body while he sat helpless in a chair beside her hospital bed, holding her hand the way he once held his rifle, steady, faithful, useless. She'd smiled at him near the end, her face pale and thin, her voice barely a whisper. "You're going to be okay, Mike," she'd said. He'd nodded, lied, told her yes, but they both knew the truth. Then it was Danny, Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves, his best friend, his swim buddy from boot camp, the man who'd saved his life in Ramadi and made him promise, if anything ever happened, to check on his little girl every birthday. Danny died 3,000 miles away in a desert Mike would never see, torn apart by an IED while Mike was stateside, standing beside Sarah's grave, unable to attend the funeral, unable to say goodbye, unable to do anything but stare at the folded flag they sent him in the mail. He couldn't save either of them, so he sold the house in Virginia, sold the furniture Sarah had picked out, the dishes she'd loved, the bed they'd shared for 27 years. He packed his truck with what little still mattered, his father's old 30-06, a few books, a medal he never wore, and his Marine Corps field jacket still stained with dust from a war the world had already forgotten. He came to the cabin to disappear, and for 8 months he did. The days blurred together. He chopped wood because it gave his hands something to do. He ate when he remembered. He slept when the nightmares led him. He walked the property line at dawn, boots crunching through frost, and tried not to think about how easy it would be to just keep walking into the mountains and never come back. No one would notice. No one would care. He was a ghost long before he died. The blizzard hit on a Tuesday night in February. Mike only knew it was Tuesday because he still marked the days on a calendar nailed to the cabin wall, an old habit from the Corps. Structure, routine, even when it didn't matter. The wind had been picking up all afternoon, rattling the windows, shaking the pines. By evening, the snow was falling sideways, thick and fast, burying the valley in white. He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside to check the woodpile near the shed. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an hour. If he didn't secure the loose tarps now, he'd lose half his firewood to the storm. The wind cut through the valley like a knife, and snow fell in thick, swirling curtains. He could barely see 10 feet ahead. That's when he heard it, faint, fragile, almost lost beneath the howl of the storm. A cry. Mike stopped mid-step, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. For a moment, he thought it was the wind playing tricks, or maybe his mind. God knew it had played enough tricks on him before. Phantom voices on the radio, shadows that looked like Danny, the smell of Sarah's perfume in an empty room. But Marines are taught to trust their instinct, and something deep in his chest tightened. He moved toward the sound, boots crunching through snow, his flashlight cutting weak arcs through the dark. The cold bit at his face, stinging his eyes, but he kept moving. The cry came again, desperate, pleading. Near the edge of the property, where the dirt road met a frozen ditch, he saw it. A cracked drainage pipe, half buried in snow and ice, surrounded by trash, frozen food wrappers, an old blanket, a cardboard box torn to shreds, signs of someone who had stopped here and left something behind, someone who didn't care. He knelt down, his knees sinking into the snow, and inside, trembling against each other in the dark, were two tiny German Shepherd puppies, barely alive. Their fur was matted with ice. Their bodies shook so violently they could barely lift their heads. One of them let out a pitiful whimper, the sound that had called him through the storm. The other one didn't move at all. Mike's throat tightened. His hands, scarred, calloused, hands that had held dying men and signed condolence letters, reached into the pipe and carefully, gently lifted them out. They were so small, so cold. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He pulled off his field jacket, the one he swore he'd never wear again, the one that still smelled faintly of desert sand and old sweat and memories he couldn't wash out, and wrapped them inside it, holding them against his chest as he ran back to the cabin. His heart pounded, not from the run, from fear. The fire roared. Mike sat on the floor in front of the hearth, the puppies cradled in his lap, rubbing warmth into their small, fragile bodies with hands that had once carried M16s and signed death notifications. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, from fear. He'd seen men die. He'd held them as they bled out, whispering promises he couldn't keep. He'd stood over graves and saluted caskets and carried the weight of every name, every face, every last breath. But this was different. This wasn't duty. This was hope, and hope was more terrifying than anything he'd ever faced. "Come on," he whispered, his voice rough and broken. Stay with me, little warriors." One of the puppies stirred, a tiny paw pressed weakly against his thumb. The other one, smaller, weaker, let out a soft, rattling breath. Mike's vision blurred. He hadn't cried when Sarah died, hadn't cried at Danny's memorial, hadn't cried in over a decade. But now, holding two half-frozen puppies he didn't know, his chest heaved and his eyes burned, and he heard himself say the words he'd been too afraid to say out loud. "Please don't leave me." The words hung in the air, raw, desperate, true. He fed them warm water from a dropper, one slow drop at a time. He wrapped them in heated towels. He stayed awake all night, watching their tiny chests rise and fall, terrified that if he closed his eyes, they'd slip away like everyone else. They survived the night. By morning, both puppies were breathing steadier, curled together in a nest of old blankets near the fire. Mike hadn't slept. He'd stayed awake, watching them, listening to every breath, every heartbeat. When the sun finally broke through the storm clouds and light poured through the cabin windows, he allowed himself to believe, just a little. He named them quietly, without ceremony. The bigger one, bold and curious, eyes already alert, Sergeant. The smaller one, gentle and watchful, who pressed close to his hand, Grace. Over the next few weeks, the cabin changed. It wasn't silent anymore. There were sounds, the shuffle of paws on wood floors, the soft snores of puppies sleeping by the fire, the scrape of kibble bowls at dawn. There was mess, chewed boots, scattered newspapers, muddy paw prints across the floor. There was life. Mike woke early to feed them. He walked them through the melting snow, watching them stumble and play and discover the world. He sat on the porch at dusk with them curled at his feet, watching the mountains turn gold in the fading light. He started adding wood to the fire again. He started cooking real meals. He started shaving, showering, caring. He started believing, just a little, that maybe surviving wasn't the same as being alive. And for the first time in 8 months, he didn't want to disappear. The nightmares still came. They always did. The convoy, the explosion, Danny's voice crackling over the radio, "Gunny, we're hit, we're hit!" And the feeling of running, lungs burning, legs pumping, but always too late, always too far, always watching the smoke rise and knowing he'd failed. Mike woke gasping, sitting upright in the dark, heart hammering like incoming mortar fire. Sweat soaked through his shirt, his hands gripped the sheets. He could still hear Danny screaming. But now something was different. 2 small bodies stirred beside him on the bed, warm, present, real. Sergeant climbed onto his chest, eyes dark and steady in the moonlight. His weight was solid, grounding. Grace pressed her nose gently against his trembling hand, her breath warm and soft. And then, quiet as a whisper, she made a sound. Not a whimper, not a bark, a word. No. Mike froze. His entire body went still. He stared down at her, barely breathing, heart pounding in his ears. She looked up at him with eyes too wise for a puppy, and again, quiet and clear, she said it. No. His heart cracked open. Tears he'd held back for years finally broke free. He pulled them both close, buried his face in their fur, and wept like a man who had finally been given permission to break. They didn't move. They just stayed, and that was enough. Word spread through Pine Hollow like wildfire. In a town as small as this, population 847, 1 diner, 1 church, 1 stoplight, news traveled fast, especially news like this. The old Marine up in the hills, the one who kept to himself, the one people whispered about at the diner over coffee and eggs, wondering if he was okay, if someone should check on him, if he needed anything. He'd rescued 2 puppies from the storm, and people said those puppies could speak. At first, Mike tried to keep it quiet. He didn't want attention, didn't want questions, didn't want people thinking he'd lost his mind. But the town began to come to him anyway. A widow named Eleanor, whose husband died in the jungles of Vietnam 50 years ago. She drove up the mountain on a Sunday afternoon, hands shaking on the wheel, and knocked softly on Mike's door. "I heard what happened," she said quietly. I needed to see." Mike let her in. She sat on the porch steps in the afternoon sun, and when Sergeant walked over and rested his head on her lap, she stroked his fur with trembling fingers, and he murmured, soft and clear, "Safe." Eleanor's face crumpled. She sobbed for the first time in 40 years, her hands clutching Sergeant's fur like a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." A young father came next. His name was Ben. He'd lost his son to an overdose 6 months ago. He hadn't spoken about it, hadn't cried, hadn't let himself feel anything. Grace walked up to him slowly, looked him in the eyes, and whispered, "Love." Ben fell to his knees and wept. A 7-year-old girl named Emma, blind since birth, came with her grandmother. She giggled when Sergeant licked her hand and said softly, "Hi." Emma laughed, a sound her grandmother said she hadn't heard in months. Mike watched it all from the doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't understand it. He didn't try to. He just knew that something sacred was happening in that cabin, something bigger than him, something he'd been chosen to protect. Then the scientists came, a team from a university out east. 3 people in clean clothes and expensive cars, carrying briefcases and tablets, and the kind of confidence that came from never having failed at anything. They'd heard the stories. They wanted to study the puppies. Brain scans, genetic tests, controlled environments, published papers. They offered money, a lot of it. They offered fame, national attention, book deals, movie rights. Think of what we could learn, the lead researcher said, standing in Mike's cabin with a briefcase and a contract already drawn up. Think of the breakthroughs, speech therapy for children, neurological treatments. You'd be helping millions of people, Mr. Callahan. Mike stood silent, arms crossed, jaw tight. He'd followed orders his entire life, listened to commanders, trusted the chain of command, done what he was told even when it didn't make sense. But this wasn't about orders. This was about love. "No," he said quietly. The researcher blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said no." "Mr. Callahan," Gunnery Sergeant, Mike corrected, his voice hard as steel, "and I understand just fine. You're making a mistake." Mike's eyes, still sharp, still steady, still the eyes of a Marine, met his without blinking. "I've made plenty of those," he said. "This isn't one of them." They left, and Mike stood on the porch, watching their taillights disappear down the mountain, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Spring came slowly to the Montana mountains. The snow melted, the valley turned green, wildflowers bloomed along the ridgeline. The puppies grew stronger, faster, more sure of themselves, and Mike realized something that broke his heart and healed it all at once. They didn't belong to him. They never had. They'd been sent to save him, but now it was time to let them go. One morning in late April, he walked them out to the edge of the property, where the forest opened wide and the mountains stretched forever into the distance. The sun was rising. The air smelled like pine and rain and new beginnings. He knelt down in the grass, his knees pressing into the soft earth. His voice cracked, something Marines rarely allow. "You weren't sent here to stay," he whispered, his hands resting gently on their heads. "You were sent to remind me I'm still alive, to remind me there's still good in the world, to remind me that love doesn't end just because people leave." Sergeant licked his hand. Grace pressed her head against his chest, right over his heart. Mike's throat tightened. "I love you both," he said, "but you deserve to be free." He opened his arms, and they ran. Into the trees, into the wild, into the world they were always meant for. One of them, Grace, stopped at the tree line. She turned back, her eyes meeting his one last time. Tap, tap, tap. 3 gentle presses of her paw against the earth. Then she was gone. Mike stood there long after they disappeared, the wind moving through the trees, the sun warm on his face. He wasn't broken. He wasn't empty. He was whole in a way he'd forgotten was possible. 3 months later, just before dawn on Easter Sunday, Mike woke to a sound at his door. Slow, deliberate, familiar. Scratch, scratch, scratch. He sat up, heart pounding. He crossed the room and opened the door. And there, standing tall and strong in the golden morning light, was Sergeant, full-grown now, powerful, eyes wise and steady and filled with something Mike could only describe as grace. He held a pine branch in his mouth, fresh, green, still wet with dew. He dropped it at Reich's feet, looked up, and in a voice rough and tender and impossibly beautifully real, he said, "Thank you." Mike didn't salute. He didn't speak. He just fell to his knees and wept, because he finally understood. God hadn't abandoned him. He'd just been waiting for Mike to remember he was worth saving. For the veterans watching this, for the Gold Star families, for the widows and widowers who still set 2 plates at dinner out of habit, for the ones who've carried weight no one sees, for the ones who've buried brothers and wondered why they're still here, for the ones who wake up at 0300 with their heart racing and don't know why, this story is for you. Because sometimes God doesn't send thunder. Sometimes he sends something small, something freezing in a ditch, something that needs you as much as you need it. Semper Fidelis isn't just about the battlefield. It's about staying faithful to hope, even when the night is long, even when you can't see the sunrise, even when you think you've given everything and there's nothing left. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. Your brothers and sisters remember. Your service mattered. Your life matters. And your heart still beats for a reason. If this story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button and join the Silent Paws and Brave Hearts family. Every week, we honor the quiet heroes, the veterans, the loyal companions, and the love that never surrenders. Ring the bell so you never miss a story that reminds you courage isn't loud, it's faithful. It's waking up every day and choosing to keep going. It's you. Thank you for watching. And thank you for your service.